ABC 7:30 has aired a special investigation exposing the moments a 65-year-old Indigenous elder was arrested in the remote community of Doomadgee in Queensland. The court found the force used on Peter O'Keefe was unlawful. There are now calls for laws to be changed around reasonable force and police powers to be overhauled. I'm joined now by Mr O'Keefe's lawyer, Scott Sear, and a warning. The vision we're going to show in this discussion may be distressing for some viewers. Welcome to you, Scott Sear. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Cass.
The force used in the arrest was deemed by a magistrate to be unlawful. The footage was described by the magistrate to be disturbing. What factors do you believe exist in Queensland that an incident such as this one could have taken place?
Well, Kirsten, it's really open currently on the law as it stands for a police officer to do anything they see as reasonable in the circumstances when arresting an individual. What I'm asking for is that we make this law prescriptive so that it gives some factors that need to be addressed by any officer who wants to use force. Some of those factors are obviously a need to be that any force applied should be proportionate to the risk faced by any officer in any given situation. Now, in this case, it wasn't proportionate. It was so far beyond that Mr O'Keefe broke his leg, his tibial head, his fibula, he ruptured his MCL, ACL, and essentially he was disfigured because this law is simply too far open. What we also need is that anything or any act done with force needs to be for a legitimate purpose. In this case, there was a reason to initially arrest him, but this is a man that's never been charged with domestic violence before, never been found guilty of it before, and if it was anybody else in any other region, we'd be up in arms. But of course, it's a man in a vulnerable position. He has very limited experience with being detained for domestic violence. And it's just not what the community expects.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about your proposals for change. Do you think the force, such as was used against your client, Peter O'Keefe, was an isolated event?
Look, unfortunately, it's not. And that's because it's just so broad and open. What we need is for the law to say we need to look at culture, age, disability. So if somebody is in a position where they have a walking stick, or if they, in Mr O'Keefe's case, if they're going to be walking across a 40-degree road, the police officer needs to say, hey, this person probably needs some footwear to walk across that road. And that's something that needs to be considered. So time's another factor. The person needs to be given enough time to comply with directions. You can't just run into an aggressive use of force. And that's most likely why the magistrate found it unlawful, because initially from the get-go, he was just pushed in the chest and he wasn't given adequate warning.
Can you give us an idea of the kinds of training that police officers actually do receive before being posted to a settlement such as Doomadgee? For our audience, we should point out that it is a large Indigenous settlement in a remote part of far northwest Queensland, many hours drive from Mount Isa, many hours air travel from Brisbane.
Certainly. Well, what we know from at least the cross-examination of Constable Limpus, who was the young officer who arrested Mr O'Keefe, is that under his cross-examination, or my cross-examination of him rather, was that he hadn't been given any specific cultural training for that community. It was simply to learn on the job. Now, there are programs that the police undertake in terms of training, but they're broad and specific to regional, or I should say urbanised centres. They don't take into consideration his background, some of the social issues that have happened in Doomadgee in the past, like the sordid history of the missions, displacement, where people have been moved, carted off from one community to the next. Really, if you turn up into a place like that, it's like another country, and it's very much still their country, and it's something that we need to respect and ensure that people going there aren't going to disturb the people there that aren't doing anything wrong.
Have you looked at the approach by police in other states and territories? Is there anywhere in Australia that is getting this right?
Well, look, we know that internationally, best practice is for force to be reasonable, proportionate, and it must be for a necessary or legitimate purpose. And we get that law from the United Kingdom. To think we're not up to speed or up to scratch with their laws is quite concerning. It's really a shame, but it's something that we're starting to, with time, winning cases like this, get a bit of attention and make sure that in the future we can close this door that allows police to essentially do anything that they see as personally reasonable in the circumstances and have a magistrate have to decide whether it was reasonable or not. What we need to try and do is make sure that right from the get-go, the officer is well aware of what he should be doing, allowing adequate time, especially in the world and the environments that we have now with big upheaval protests all over the world. What we need is a police force that won't jump the gun, exercise their powers in a way that is confronting, or exercise their powers in a way that the community does not expect. That's what this law is guiding our police officers towards. And it's not fair that they have that sweeping power.
Just finally and briefly, what reaction have you
Yes.
had to your suggested Peters law?
Well, it's still in its infancy, really. We're taking suggestions from anyone as to how this law should be drafted, but I do have a full brief amendment that's sought, and it would be into 615 of the Police Powers Act, Powers and Responsibilities Act. That's in Queensland, but really we need a national overhaul so that this is the law in every state of the country, because as we see, it's happening in every state. So we need to have strict guidance for our police officers to follow pretty rigid steps. Is this person 65? Should we be arresting him in a heavy-handed manner? Probably not. And that's just one of the factors. Another factor might be their culture or their particular race. Does this particular race have an adverse reaction to police turning up in a confrontational way, or a way that might trigger some emotions or unsettle the past? We have some communities here, and certainly some deaths that we've had in the past at the hands of the police, like Neil Banjo, and there's still that trauma in the community, and people have a lack of trust for police. I think they're doing a very good job at trying to mend that, but the law should reflect that so that they're not responsible for that.
Scott Sear, Peter O'Keefe's lawyer, talking to us from Normanton in Queensland's Gulf Country. Thank you very much for your time.